Welcome to the RISC forest garden. This has all the classic features of an edible forest. It has the 7 layers, but all this is growing on 30 centimetres of substrate on a roof. The garden was planted in 2001, and really it was a response to a problem that we had of a flat roof well past its sell-by date. It was leaking, and so we looked for creative opportunities to try to raise the funds. The garden cost £50,000 from the National Lottery, and about half of this budget went to actually repairing the roof, and about another half went to creating the garden. The engineers told us that we could get away with 30 centimetres of substrate and that this would be able to be accommodated on the existing roof structure, so we didn't have to pay anything extra to strengthen it in order to take the loading. The problem is when it's saturated, so after a lot of rain, obviously the weight of the roof is increased considerably. The retrofit was relatively straightforward. The contractors had to replace some of the marine ply, and then the core of a green roof is both preventing water and also root penetration of the structure. There's lots of different systems which are available on the market now. Ours uses a special layer of roofing felt which has herbicide in it, and that helps to prevent the little rootlets from penetrating the main waterproofing layer. And then it's also important to have an insulation layer, because although dry soil is quite a good insulator, when it's saturated it does conduct heat, so there's also a insulation layer. And then on top of that there's a drainage layer, so this is a bit like plastic egg boxes, and so any water percolates through the substrate. There's a membrane which stops all the fines from getting into the drainage layer, and then it flows along through the drainage layer on top of the waterproofing layer to a number of drainage points along the roof. And we were very lucky because some of the existing drainage from the original roof was still absolutely fine, and we just had to cut into it and could use it as the basis of our water harvesting system. It's about 200 square metres, about 30 metres by 6, and it has punctuations of skylights and ventilation shafts, and so that had to be incorporated into the design by Paul Barney, who's a local permaculturalist who runs the well-known forest garden permaculture nursery called Edulis. So the initial planting list was about 120 different varieties of useful plant, and that's now expanded to about 180. The planting is absolutely perfect for creating a multi-purpose space. It's very varied, it has year-round interest, and there's a beautiful combination of textures, colours, variations on the theme of green, if you like. It can also be used to tell all kinds of stories. So, for example, the whole importance of plants in culture, in art, in poetry. And it's a way in which we can engage a very, very diverse audience and get them switched on to just thinking about ways in which they can make their own lifestyles much more sustainable. The thing that really surprises most visitors is how we could have such amazing growth. These huge, great 6-7 metre cherry trees, mature cherry trees, the loquat, and some of the other larger, sort of our version of the canopy layer. And that was a bit of a puzzle as to how they could put on so much growth with just a very shallow substrate. And it was in Robert Curick's book about roots that the answer really revealed itself. And there he argues that a lot of the uptake of both water and nutrients is actually in that top layer of soil, so the top 40 centimetres or so. We have 30, and so we're not doing too bad as long as we top dress it with nutrients. This garden really demonstrates what's possible on a roof. It's become much more recognised that green roofs really are part of the solution to the climate crisis. They can create sustainable urban drainage so that About 85% of the water that falls on this footprint is absorbed in the garden rather than going into the storm water system. So that's one way in which green roofs generally are one of the ingredients of sustainable urban design. Another is how green roofs can help to reduce urban temperatures, the so-called urban heat island effect. Having that kind of growth on top of buildings will help to cool the urban landscape. So there have been a lot of lessons from our experience over the last 20 years. The greatest one, I think, is that it is possible to create forest garden on very limited substrate. It is an option for lots of organisations who are wanting to make their buildings much more sustainable, as well as to create a space which they can use for all kinds of community purposes, as an outdoor classroom, as a demonstration hub, but also to get that kind of productivity of food production onto their footprint of their building. The other thing has been that one of the problems of green roofs in urban spaces is pollution from roads, so particularly heavy metals. And research done by the University of Reading has shown that in fact that's not a problem, that there are heavy metals but that they're not of a critical magnitude. So that's been a really good thing. But I guess the big question mark for this as a long-term sustainable solution is how we keep it alive as climate change really kicks in. We are reliant on harvesting the water, but with such a very intensive sort of planting, the demand is very high. And so in periods of drought, we are dependent on mains water. And if, as predicted, water shortages become an increasing problem, we then have the possibility that the garden will die in a drought when the only supply of water is on standpipes, because we simply won't be able to keep it alive. So that's the big question mark. And so I suppose the lesson for other projects like this is how can you secure your water supply in a world where water shortages are going to become increasingly possible. One solution might be to create a cistern where during the winter we build up large enough reservoir of water to irrigate during the summer, flushing toilets during the winter. And the other possibility would have been to sink a borehole. The other lesson that we've discovered over the past 20 years is that if we were going to do this again, we could be much more varied in the whole kind of structure, the hard landscaping. So this is pretty well uniformly 30 centimetres over the whole area. It is in effect one large hanging basket with 30 centimetres of substrate. What we could have done had we realised is that we could have had greater depth at the edges, because the loading obviously is greatest in the middle, that we could have had deeper substrate at the edges, and that's where we could have put the larger trees that would need that reservoir of water and of nutrients, which is one of the key problems of a forest on a green roof. That is, how do you provide that kind of resilience in periods of drought? How can you provide the nutrients? And the answer for us is that we have to import it. We can't produce enough nitrogen from nitrogen fixing plants in the garden, so it has to be imported. So we use organic horse manure, or we use other kinds of compost, so it's bringing in that kind of fertility. So that is one of the major limitations of a green roof in this kind of situation. But what we've shown is that a forest garden is part of the menu. This is part of what is an option for architects and developers. It's less wild than many forest gardens, but nevertheless, for our purposes, in an urban setting, it's absolutely perfect. One of the unintended consequences of the garden has been a whole new area of RISC's work. In 2010, we set up Food for Families, inspired by the very positive responses that visitors to the garden gave us. And so since then, we've set up over 25 gardens all around Reading, working with schools and community groups, passing on our own knowledge, developing those kind of skills within the communities, building community resilience. And I suppose if we were looking for one of the fantastic legacies of this crazy idea to put a forest on a roof, then this is one of them.